Well, welcome everybody to the latest Zoom talk from Leeds Theosophical Society. This is the last in the present sequence and we'll be starting again sometime in September. We've been doing this now for 4 years and it's been a very, very interesting and broad-ranging number of speakers and topics that we've covered during that time. So thank you all very much for your support. This afternoon, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Steve Taylor, who has spoken to us before on a couple of occasions. Steve is the senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University, and he's also the author of a number of best-selling books, which we'll be talking about, including his latest one, which the details of that are in the chat box. So if you could all mute yourselves apart from Steve, and welcome, and it's good to see you again. When you spoke to us, I think it was last year or the year before, you mentioned something which I found deeply intriguing. It's when you were talking about post-traumatic growth. And I found this absolutely fascinating about how people who go through terrible experiences, which would crush other people, suddenly find some inner strength or whatever it might be, and actually are able to embark on a process of change in their life. I think it would be just interesting before we, go on to a wider conversation, just for you to explain that, because it's something which I think will resonate with an awful lot of people.
It's quite a well-researched concept in psychology, post-traumatic growth. And I think the official statistic is that 47% of people who go through trauma will experience positive personal development afterwards, even if it sometimes takes years to manifest itself. And they break it down into a number of areas. One area is appreciation. People feel an enhanced appreciation for aspects of their lives that maybe they used to take for granted. Their relationships become stronger, more authentic. They have a wider sense of perspective. They're not as concerned with trivial things anymore. They have a sense of what's really important in life. And they become more spiritual, more philosophical. So there's a deepening effect that comes in the aftermath of trauma. And it's a great thing, really, because it teaches us that the challenges and the crises that we go through in life can and often do have a positive aftermath.
It sounds in some ways, it's probably not, but it sounds to have some of the same characteristics of a near-death experience where people often come back deeply transformed by what's happened to them in that interim period.
It's true. I mean, I wrote a book about these type of experiences, which is called Extraordinary Awakenings. And I wrote about a very intense form of post-traumatic growth, which I call transformation through turmoil. And that's when people undergo quite a radical shift in identity after very traumatic experiences. So a good example is a diagnosis of cancer, also bereavement. It could be a long period of depression or addiction. But in the aftermath of those experiences, usually when they're at their lowest point, they undergo usually a sudden and dramatic shift. It's almost as if their normal identity dissolves away in response to the pressure and the stress that they're facing, and a new identity emerges in its place. So some people, it's almost as if they have a latent spiritual self, which doesn't normally express itself, but when they go through this intense trauma, this latent spiritual self emerges and becomes a normal identity. And once it's established, in most cases, it's a permanent shift. That is their identity for the rest of their lives. And the shift is so radical that people sometimes describe it as, feeling like they're a different person living in the same body. And just to go back to your question, eventually, near-death experience is a good example of that. That's probably the most intense transformational experience that people go through, the near-death experience. And in almost every case, it leads to a permanent shift in identity.
Okay. I'd like to talk a little bit about your own career. You combine an interest in spirituality, obviously, and psychology. Which came first, or was it a kind of a parallel stream which ran through your life?
Good question. Probably spirituality came first because I wasn't really aware of psychology. We didn't do psychology at my school, so I wasn't really aware of psychology. Even in sixth form, we didn't do psychology, so I wasn't really aware of psychology as a field until later in life. But I was interested in spirituality. Well, interested is probably the wrong word, but I certainly had what I would call spiritual inclinations or experiences when I was in my teenage years. But I didn't understand them at the time. I wouldn't have used the word spiritual to describe them. But I responded to poetry. I started to write poetry when I was quite young, maybe 16, and I responded to the spiritual aspects of certain poems, like William Wordsworth or Walt Whitman, D.H. Lawrence, people like that. So that was my first my sort of entry point into spirituality was through poetry originally.
So this interest in both spirituality and psychology, is spirituality still a bit of a forbidden territory within mainstream psychology, or is it now
Hmm.
very much a part of it?
Well, I mean, mainstream psychology would probably dismiss spirituality as some sort of aberration or some sort of they would try to explain spiritual experiences or spiritual inclinations in terms of brain activity, maybe like a malfunctioning of certain parts of the brain. Um, but that's just mainstream psychology. I mean, there are lots of fields in psychology, and there are some fields where where people are open to spirituality. Like there's many psychologists these days are interested in psychedelics, and obviously that's related to spirituality. Many psychologists and certainly psychotherapists are interested in mindfulness and other forms of meditation, which is a form of spirituality. And then there is my own field of psychology, well, the field of psychology in which I mainly orientate myself, which is transpersonal psychology, which is, explicitly concerned with spirituality. So even though I think there is a mainstream of traditional psychologists who are a little skeptical about spirituality, I think, outside that, there's a lot of interest.
And of course, this is all accompanying a time when there is intense interest in what consciousness actually is. And a number of
Mm.
writers are really dealing with this and questioning the prevailing view that it's basically mind is an epiphenomenon of the brain. It's just a byproduct of the electrochemical activity in the brain. And that's still a very
Mm.
widespread view, isn't it?
Well, it was a widespread view. I'm not sure how widespread it is now, actually, because I think there's been an interesting change over the last few years. I think going back, say, 15, 20 years ago, it was taken for granted that consciousness is produced by brain activity. The mind is just a kind of shadow of the brain, and all our thoughts can be traced back to chemical reactions in the brain. But in recent years, there's been a kind of realization that consciousness is much more complex than that, that it's far too simplistic to try to reduce it to brain activity. There are lots of issues with trying to explain consciousness in those terms. There are some sort of basic issues like, there is a number of kind of mismatches between brain activity and consciousness. Well, one is that people always assume that consciousness is produced by the firing of brain cells. But there are lots of situations where a person may be unconscious, but the brain is still firing away in a very intense way, like when people are in a coma, for example, or when people are unconscious due to an epileptic seizure. Their brain is still firing away very intensely, but there's no consciousness there. And there are lots of situations when the brain becomes very inactive, but consciousness can be very intense. I mean, coma is a good example. In other types of coma, people can have, a very extremely minimal level of brain activity, but they have intense conscious experiences. And also, an even more extreme example is near-death experiences when people, don't appear to have any brain activity. The brain shuts down. When a person stops breathing, there's no oxygen going to their brain, so the brain shuts down, but they still report very intense conscious experiences. So, and there's another more general issue, which is sometimes called the hard problem, which you probably read about. And that's that, the brain is just basically the brain is a lump of gray matter. You could hold it in your hand, it would be this soggy lump of gray matter, about as heavy as a small bag of sugar. And, no matter how intensely you look inside the brain, you could get a microscope and look intensely inside the brain at the most minuscule elements of matter inside the brain, inside brain cells. And you'd never find anything resembling consciousness or anything that could produce consciousness. It's just physical stuff.
Mm.
So physical stuff, how can physical stuff produce consciousness? It's like a magical trick. It's like turning water into wine. It's a completely different thing altogether. So at the end, and that is a basic philosophical problem which a lot of people are aware of. And but another basic thing is that people have been studying the brain for decades now, in expectation that they'll find a part of the brain which is responsible for consciousness, or that they'll find processes in the brain that are responsible for consciousness. But they found absolutely nothing. That they're still completely in the dark about how the brain could produce consciousness. There were lots of theories, but there were so many theories that they just end up contradicting each other. Once you've got 50 different theories, it's time to admit that maybe something is wrong. Maybe the sort of the assumptions that are behind these theories are wrong. And I think that's the point where we're at now, and a lot of people are beginning to realize that.
One of the most persuasive accounts of all this that I read, and no doubt you've read it, is Proof of Heaven by Dr. Eben Alexander, who some years ago, he suffered some sort of meningitis and went into a week-long coma during which there was no brain activity. And I think he was a doctor specializing in these things. And he went through this intense experience going through different levels of reality, which he later wrote about in his book. And he previously been a die-hard materialist who thought that all this stuff was mumbo jumbo, but he came back from this completely transformed by it all, to the extent that he wrote this book. And I'm sure that book, like yours and other people, is starting to have an impact now on these non-material views of what consciousness is.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are a lot of skeptics who've tried to explain away his experiences in some form, but nobody, can. It's such an unusual experience, which seems to contradict so many assumptions of the standard model of reality that, it is quite powerful. I mean, another similar one. I always think of Aben Alexander in parallel with Anita Moorjani. I think she became well known at roughly the same time, and she also had a very powerful near-death experience when she was on the verge of death. And near-death experiences, they have a similar kind of the similar characteristics. And well, one of them, I mean, her experience was slightly different in that she experienced a powerful healing during her near-death experience. She was seriously ill with cancer. She was close to dying with cancer, but in the midst of her near-death experience, during her near-death experience, her cancer somehow healed. And the doctors, there are lots of medical notes that are available from her period in hospital, and her doctors were completely confused. It didn't seem to make any medical sense that her cancer could heal so suddenly and dramatically in the midst of her experience, in the midst of her near-death experience. But yeah, I think those kind of cases, no matter how skeptics try to explain them away, they're so powerful and convincing that they do point to a completely different model of reality.
And you're saying that over the last 10, 15, 20 years, things like this have permeated more and more into the mainstream to bring about a change in the mindset. Is it true to say that?
Certainly within academia, within the sort of academic community, which is it tends to be very skeptical and very left brain, very kind of rationalistic. I mean, like I say, within the field of consciousness studies, there aren't that many people who still believe that consciousness can actually be explained in terms of brain activity. I think in the general population, people still assume that that's the case because what's happening in science has not really permeated into the general population yet. But I think, there aren't many. It's kind of like the taken for granted now that the standard explanation of consciousness has been disputed. I mean, there was a famous example recently that you may have read about where there was a philosopher called David Chalmers, and in 1998, I think it was, he made a bet with another philosopher of consciousness called Christoph Koch, a German neuroscientist. And Christoph Koch bet David Chalmers that in 2023 we would have a clear idea about how the brain produces consciousness. So that they agreed on the bet in 1998. And last year in 2023, Christoph Koch agreed that he had lost the bet, that there is no clear idea about how the brain produces consciousness. So David Chalmers won a case of wine from Christoph Koch. But that's where we are, that, it's kind of like the standard idea now that the brain cannot produce consciousness directly.
Okay, let's look at your own work, Steve. Well, what was your first book and what prompted you to get into writing about these things?
Well, I wrote a few books that were never published and hopefully will never be published. I should probably destroy them just to make sure that they never get published. But I think every writer goes through it. Every writer spends a few years just trying to, it's like an apprenticeship. You spend a few years just teaching yourself to write, and you write a couple of awful books just in the process of teaching yourself to write. It's about the discipline. So writing is a discipline. It demands focus and concentration. So you have to build it up. You got to learn to sit still for a few hours a day and sit at your writing table, which I found very difficult for a long time. So apart from my unpublishable books, I actually wrote 3 or 4 novels originally. I thought I wanted to be a novelist, so I wrote novels as a way of training myself to write. But once I was in my late 20s, I think about 29, when I realized, this doesn't seem right. Maybe I should be writing. Because I'd always been interested in spirituality and psychology. So at the age of 29, it suddenly occurred to me, maybe I should be writing about spirituality and psychology. Maybe I shouldn't be writing novels. And as soon as I switched to writing about spirituality and psychology, everything changed. I'd spent sort of 10 years getting rejections from publishers, trying to publish stories and novels. But as soon as I switched to spirituality and psychology, my writing began to flow a lot easier. I wrote very quickly. It just seemed right. I thought, this is what I should be doing. And I also found it easy to get published as well. I started to publish articles straight away. But it still took me a few years to publish a book. My first book was published when I was 35 years old, I think, about 20 years ago. And it was a book about time. It was called Out of Time. And I developed an interest in time perception, about why time passes at different speeds in different situations. I was interested in altered states of consciousness where time sort of disappears or stretches out radically. So I did a few sort of informal experiments to demonstrate the different ways in which time passes quickly or slowly in different situations. I collected reports of different people's experiences. And I published that book through a small publisher called Porpoise Press in 2003. It was partly because I developed a friendship with Colin. You remember Colin Wilson, the author?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I developed a friendship with him. We sort of corresponded, and I visited him a couple of times. And he offered to write. He said to me once, "Steve, if you find a publisher for your book, I'll write a foreword for it." And I thought, oh yeah, he probably says that to everybody. But when it came down to it, he did say, "Oh yes, of course I'll write it." So he wrote me this fantastic foreword, and the publisher was interested. Probably because of his foreword, the publisher was interested, and the book was published.
And subsequently, when did you start to bring the more spiritual aspects of that into your, well, you said you did it from the very start, but when did this develop a deeper significance?
Well, I've never really separated psychology and spirituality. So all of my books have a spiritual element. Even that book about time, there is a chapter on mystical experiences because time disappears in mystical experiences. There's a chapter on precognition. Um, but I guess I began to do research on spiritual experiences in about 2009, 2010. I did a PhD, I did a master's degree and a PhD specializing in studying spiritual experiences, or I call them awakening experiences, moments in which our consciousness expands and intensifies, and we feel a sense of connection or oneness with all things. So I guess that was about 15 years ago. 2010, my book Waking from Sleep was published in 2010, and that was a study of awakening experiences.
Which brings us very neatly onto your latest book, which is Spiritual Awakenings. And what I like about the title of this, a practical guide, not just anything, but a practical guide. Can you talk us through this and tell us what that's all about?
The book is called The Adventure. And as you say, the subtitle is A Practical Guide to Spiritual Awakening. Partly, I wanted to write this book because, like a lot of spiritual explorers, when I was younger, and still occasionally nowadays, I went to a lot of talks by spiritual teachers and went to a lot of spiritual groups. And I usually, often I was a little bit disappointed because there are lots of spiritual teachers who can explain what it means to be enlightened or how the world appears through an awakened perception. But often they didn't really say, okay, well, this is what you need to do. This is what you should do. Why don't you go home and this is a program of exercises to try to create, and these exercises will create or cultivate an enlightened awareness. So there's a lot, kind of an absence of practicality in some spiritual teachings. So I wanted to try to correct that in my book. But also, about 5 years ago, I published a book called The Leap, with the subtitle A Psychology of Spiritual Awakening. And that was an attempt to summarize all of my research into spiritual awakening, my personal research, my personal explorations, and also my academic research. And I wanted to just explain spirituality from a psychological perspective, to explain what enlightenment or awakening means from a psychological perspective. And after the book was published, I did a number of talks and workshops, as I usually do when a book's published. But I realized that, when you do a workshop, you have to have an experiential element. You have to lead people through exercises and meditations. So I began to create exercises and meditations and other types of practices to give people a kind of experiential glimpse of spiritual awakening. And eventually, I created a lot of exercises and specific meditations, and that became the book. So the book it is actually based on the workshops I've led. So every chapter of the book deals with a certain quality which is prominent in spiritual awakening. For example, disidentification from the ego, presence, gratitude, acceptance, and so altruism and so forth. And the book mainly consists of exercises and meditations to cultivate those characteristics. So it is meant to be a kind of guidebook, that will lead to spiritual awakening. I've always thought that spiritual awakening is much more accessible than many people believe. I think because we're used to thinking of enlightenment as a kind of rarefied, unattainable state. We kind of think, oh, no, I can't be spiritually awakened. I'm just a normal guy, or I'm just a normal person. I can't reach the heights of the mystics or the monks. But I disagree. I think spiritual awakening is attainable if you follow. There are certain practices and exercises which inevitably lead to some degree of spiritual awakening. I mean, maybe the important point is that there are degrees of spiritual awakening. It's not kind of either or state. So I think many people do experience some degree of spiritual wakefulness.
So in your practical work, when you're doing these workshops with, I imagine, quite a wide variety of people, what were the most effective techniques that you found affected or were helpful to most people?
Good question. I'll have to ponder for a second.
I mean, you mentioned the word acceptance. From a personal perspective. And I found that very, very helpful in my life, because I've always tended to, rebel against circumstances and everything. And sometimes you just have to cooperate with what's happening, and rather than just trying to fight it head on, and accept, your situation and where you're at and what do we do about it? Yeah.
Yeah, acceptance certainly, I have a number of exercises which are designed to cultivate acceptance. Yeah, they can be quite powerful. But I think that maybe on the most immediate level, I found that the process of disidentifying from the ego mind can be quite powerful, because that's kind of like the entry point into spiritual awakening. So many people are completely identified with their thought minds, and they don't realize it. They're always immersed in thought chatter in their minds. Their mood is always determined by the content of their minds. If they might find themselves in a bad mood, feeling depressed, it's because the content of their thoughts is negative. They might find themselves feeling guilty or worried about the future, and it's all because of the content of their minds. Or they might feel themselves to be they might find themselves in a traumatic state of mind, feeling anxious and feeling all kinds of types of psychological discord, because the mind is filled with traumatic memories of past events. So for some people, it's kind of revelation when they find that they don't have to identify with the content of their minds. They can just sort of step away, step out of it, and just observe it without being immersed in it. So I have an exercise where it's kind of like a visualization exercise. Well, it is a visualization exercise where I ask people to imagine that they're sitting on the bank of a river, watching the stream go by, and aware of the space between them and the river, in a state of stillness and calmness. And they just observe the river flowing by, aware of the distance between them and the river. And then they take the same perspective towards their thoughts. They watch their thoughts go by as if they're on a riverbank, separate from the thoughts, with this space between them and their thoughts. And as I say, that can be a revelation to realize that you are not your thoughts. You are the observer of your thoughts. And even if you feel affected by past trauma, simply to step outside the stream of thoughts and feelings too, and to observe them gives you a freedom. It gives you a freedom from the trauma. And people also find that once they step outside the stream of thought and observe it, it starts to slow down, because the stream of thought is fueled by the attention we give it, and it's fueled by our immersion in it. So when we step outside it, it starts to slow down, and maybe we experience periods of mental quietness, when there's a space between thoughts, when there are no thoughts. And that's the ideal state to be in.
This, of course, very much echoes some of the key ideas of theosophy and similar traditions, where the mind is separated into two: a lower mind, a concrete mind, sometimes called the monkey mind, uncontrolled, jumping around from one thing to another, obsessed with trivial thoughts; and then a higher mind, which can create and conceptualize and appreciate noble things like truth and beauty and that sort of thing. Does your work kind of reflect this, and creating that passageway, which sometimes is called the rainbow bridge, the antakarana, which is supposed to unite these two parts of our mind? Does that chime in with your work at all?
Definitely, yeah. I think that the ego mind, or the lower mind, or whatever you want to call it, the thought mind, the monkey mind, is basically a kind of an aberration. I don't think it serves much useful function at all. But and in fact, we know that when the monkey mind becomes quiet, that's when we do become creative. We tap into higher potentials, and that's when we feel a sense of well-being too. But when the monkey mind is sort of restless, and when it takes over our awareness, so there's just a feeling of unease. It's a feeling of disturbance too, because of these crazy thoughts streaming through our minds. So yeah, I think I think one of the characteristics of highly creative people, people who are maybe described as geniuses, is that they do have the ability to transcend the surface mind, the lower mind, and tap into these higher potentials. And there's this flow of higher creative energy from their higher minds, which is not blocked by the activity of the lower mind. And one of the problems with the lower mind is that it can block, forms a kind of obstruction, so it stops the energies and potentials from the higher mind flowing into our awareness.
And of course, in theosophy and other traditions, we also talk about something even higher than the higher mind, which is sometimes called wisdom intuition, which is a form of perception which transcends the intellectual process itself. Is this something that you've had any ideas about?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I would separate that from the higher mind. I mean, I would probably, from my perspective, I would say that that kind of intuitive wisdom is an aspect of the higher mind, which arises when the surface mind becomes quiet. I mean, I don't know. It depends how you categorize these things. But certainly, I think there is an intuitive awareness, a higher intuitive awareness, which is superior to the thoughts of the lower mind.
You've,
And
sorry.
sorry, and that's again, this is one of the characteristics of spiritually awakened people, is that they have easy access to these levels of the mind, and their actions and decisions, they may be slightly slower than other people's. The monkey mind is obviously reacts very quickly, but because that they operate more slowly and intuitively, their decisions tend to be the right ones, and that their lives tend to flow a lot more smoothly than other people's.
You find with a lot of creative people in all sorts of fields of endeavor, engineering, mathematics, sometimes literature, painting, all the arts, anything that involves a creative process, often the people don't really understand the process about where these ideas have come from, and they come from numerous different sources. Does this persuade you that basically people are not having original thoughts at all? They are simply accessing them from some higher pool of knowledge. I mean, in the East, this would be very much an Eastern point of view, and the Western idea that we are creative, individualistic people who have original thoughts would be somewhat alien to that kind of mentality. What's your view on all that?
I agree. I think there is something very mysterious about creativity, and creativity has never really been explained. There are some kind of reductionist attempts to explain creativity. I remember reading a woman called Susan Blackmore, who's quite skeptical, and she explains creativity as a kind of mishmash of memes. We have all these memes in our minds that we've absorbed from our culture, and they kind of every now and then they get mixed up and produced what seems to be a novel bit of creativity, but it's just a mixture of the memes, which I think is complete nonsense. Yeah, there is something creativity. I know from my own experience from writing poetry and music, it comes from somewhere else. It comes from a transcendent place beyond the normal mind. And again, that's one of the characteristics of highly creative people. That they can't really explain where their creativity comes from, and they can't really explain their creativity. It comes through them. It doesn't come from them. It comes through them. It's a kind of channeling. And a lot of the most famous composers and poets have described their creativity in those terms. Mozart apparently said, I don't compose music, I just hear it and I write it down. It's there, it comes into my mind and I just write it down. There are so many examples of great songs that were channeled, like Beatles songs that were channeled rather than consciously written. And also, scientific ideas. Most of the significant scientific discoveries, or many of them, were not consciously produced through the rational mind. They suddenly unfolded in daydreams or in actual dreams. There's some scientific who were like I think it was Niels Bohr, who discovered the structure of the atom, and it appeared to him in a dream. He saw it in his dream. And James Watt, who discovered the steam engine, he was daydreaming while on a walk one day, and it just appeared in his mind again as a kind of visual image. So these things, they don't come from the mind; they come from some sort of cosmic reservoir of ideas and insight and inspiration, something transcendent and mysterious.
Do you think that the people who have the ability to access these realms are just born with it, or do you believe this is a skill that people can be taught and which they can learn and develop?
I think, but to an extent, people are born with with these abilities, but I think we can all develop them to some degree. What the main characteristic of these people who have access to transcendent creativity, it seems to be that their kind of ego boundaries are quite soft. I think many people have a kind of solid ego which doesn't allow anything into it. It's like a hard shell which doesn't allow energies and potentials or spiritual experiences to flow through. But other people have a very kind of soft, very labial boundaries, which are which are so soft that material flows through. So you can think of this in terms of like psychic experiences, creative experiences, or spiritual experiences. All of these anomalous types of experiences, they can flow through a person whose mental boundaries are quite soft. So I think this is what happens, if your ego boundaries are quite soft, you will be a creative person. You'll have psi experiences every now and then. You'll have spiritual experiences. You'll be empathic, intuitive. Unfortunately, you may be slightly prone to psychological disturbances too, because it can be quite overwhelming when your self boundaries are quite soft and so much information is flowing through that, especially when you're younger, there may be a bit of instability there. That's definitely true in my case. I had a lot of a certain degree of psychological instability when I was younger, and depression and feeling kind of overwhelmed by the world because so much material was coming through. But yeah, and I think the normal syndrome is that as people get older, their boundaries tend to become a bit stronger. It's just I don't know why, but that's why there are so many creative geniuses who sort of dry up as they get older because their boundaries somehow get stronger. Maybe if they achieve some success, it kind of reinforces their ego and makes their ego boundaries stronger, and they lose their creative genius. Or maybe I don't know. Maybe it's part of the process of aging. I don't know. And there are lots of poets who sort of produced their best work when they were relatively young. But that doesn't have to be the case. There are certain things we can do to keep our boundaries open, to keep our boundaries soft. And that's what we need to do. We need to keep our boundaries soft and open. And there are definitely things we can do. Like meditation is one obvious, fantastic way of doing that. For me, one of the main aims of meditation is to quieten my monkey mind and make sure I still have access to my higher mind, and also to keep my boundaries soft, keep me open to creative potentials.
Well, as we draw this fascinating conversation to a conclusion, can I ask you, Steve, what you're working on now and what future projects might involve, especially as they include your interest in spiritual matters?
Well, speaking of creativity, I had a very creative couple of years, and I've got another book which is being published in November. And this, I think we started talking about my book on time from 2003. So interestingly, it's another book about time. I've kind of resumed my interest in time perception. It's a book called Time Expansion Experiences, which is basically a study of, well, it started when I had a car crash. And, as people often say in car crashes, time just stretched, time expanded. And in reality, I probably just had a few seconds of spinning around on the motorway on the M60, just outside Manchester. But in my mind, it felt like, wow, it must at least a minute or so. These few seconds stretched into a minute. And it was really quite a bizarre experience. So it led me to do research on those experiences. So I collected hundreds of cases of time expansion experiences from other people. A lot of them were from accidents, from falls, from falling off a horse or falling down a staircase. But others were from psychedelics, from deep meditation, from being in love, and from a whole range of different experiences. And also I look into near-death experiences too, when time seems to disappear. In some near-death experiences, time just seems to disappear entirely. I look into the phenomenon of the life review, when a person's whole lifetime of experiences are replayed or recalled or relived in a few seconds. So yeah, that's going to be out towards the end of this year.
Well, thank you very much indeed for one of the most interesting conversations I've certainly had in a long time, and I'm sure that the participants have enjoyed it as much as I